Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Duchesneau. I am a senior P12 research associate with the Education Trust's National Office in DC, and I lead our work on social, emotional, and academic development. You are in the session on grading states on social, emotional, and academic development, which is a preview of a series of state scans that we've done, which will be released this coming winter. So today I'm going to just go through a bit of framing around social, emotional, and academic development with an equity lens. And then I'll talk about the 50 state scans that we've been working on. And we'll have an opportunity to talk about how we can use the scan for advocacy. And of course, I'll take questions at the end. But you should also feel free to put questions in the room chat if you have any as they come up. So I want to start by saying that the science of learning and development has shown that all learning is inherently social and emotional. Whether we feel like we belong, matter, have strong relationships, and are emotionally well, all matter for how we engage with academic content. And I'm going to give an example throughout this presentation to highlight that. I'd like for you all to imagine Grace, a Black girl on the first day of her senior year of high school this year. In the past year, while school is virtual because of the pandemic, her grandmother passed away from COVID-19, and her family has had some financial struggles. Grace has stepped up a lot at home, doing extra chores around the house, getting involved in her community. She marched in Black Lives Matter marches and sewed masks for her community. But now she's returning to in-person learning at school, and she's really excited. She walks into her homeroom class, and her teacher notices her hair twists and says, "That hairstyle is prohibited. You'll need to go to the office." Grace gets upset, but she walks to the office and she receives a warning. If she doesn't change her hairstyle before tomorrow, she'll be sent home from school. Grace goes to her first period class, which is AP History, and notices as she walks in that she is the only Black student in the class. She pauses, and the teacher looks at her and says, "This is AP History. Do you belong in this class?" Grace gets pretty upset at this microaggression, but she says yes. She sits down. She reminds herself that she's going to ace this class, and the teacher responds, "You don't have to get an attitude about it." During lunch, Grace is self-aware enough to recognize that she needs some mental health support given everything that's happening at home and at school that day, so she looks for the school counselor, but they're too busy to see her. So later that day, Grace participates in a social emotional learning program run by her homeroom teacher, who starts off by discussing a little pointedly at Grace how important it is for students to control their emotions and make responsible decisions. And understandably, Grace feels a bit frustrated. And so often when we hear about social and emotional learning, what they're talking about is learning competencies or skills like these. We want students to learn to manage their emotions and behavior, to make responsible decisions, and to believe in their ability to achieve. Yes, absolutely. And because these skills are so valuable, more than 90% of schools and districts say they're working to support the social and emotional learning of their students. And while they're almost always well-intentioned, too often the approaches used are about identifying a skill or competency that kids allegedly don't have or don't have enough of, and so are based in building these skills without clear attention to the learning environments that influence social and emotional development. But as you could see from Grace's experience, social emotional learning programs that focus exclusively on teaching these skills isn't the whole picture we need to look at, and it's not fair to tell students of color to control their anger without also confronting the systemic racism that is understandably anger-inducing. And this is worrisome because, as Grace's story shows, context matters. The racism Grace experienced, the responsibilities Grace had outside of school, and her cultural background all influence social emotional development and whether her teachers see Grace as competent in social emotional skills. And this year especially, we have to take context into account because of the stress we've all experienced from COVID-19, the tumultuous politics, and our national reckoning with racial injustice, which will certainly influence the well-being of students, especially students of color, as they re-enter classrooms. And so when schools use approaches that don't use an explicit equity lens or acknowledge the role students' racial and cultural experiences have in social and emotional development, or fail to address the processes and structures in schools that systemically disadvantage students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, immigrant youth, and other marginalized students, or treat social emotional learning as separate from academics, then we see something like Grace's experience play out, where students are told they're not meeting social and emotional norms when they're actually excelling at those social and emotional skills. And that can actually do more harm than good. So with these concerns in mind, we released a report last year of a qualitative study in which students and families of color across the country discussed their experiences and what schools should be doing to support social, emotional, and academic development, or SEAD, for students of color. And we learned that they're worried too. Many students of color already have and are expected by society to learn advanced social and emotional skills because of the context of race. Grace's control of her emotions when her AP teacher asked if she belonged in an AP class, or her continued belief in her ability to achieve in that class, for example. And yet, they're not recognized for that social and emotional competence, often because there's a gap between schools and their communities and a misunderstanding of students' experiences. And what's more, our participants credited racial, ethnic, and cultural identity development as the core of social, emotional, and academic development, but noted that this is too often missing from conversations around social emotional learning. So often, our participants expressed that they didn't trust schools to explicitly teach these skills without first addressing the systemic racism and adult bias in schools. And as one student said, many students of color already have these advanced skills. And despite that, the way the schools are structured now and the way education is structured is not set up for students to succeed in those environments. And that's not to say that students don't succeed, but not all students do. Some students make it out, but aren't ready for the world after high school or even after middle school. So it's like you're not always set up to succeed based on how schools are structured. And so this requires us to shift our focus. And currently we see a disproportionate focus on trying to fix kids by teaching them social and emotional skills. And instead we should broaden our focus to address the context and the learning environments in which students are developing. So in our report, we discussed 6 policy recommendations to really create environments that support integrated and equity-focused social, emotional, and academic development. And that includes providing meaningful professional development and supports, engaging students, families, and communities as full partners in schooling, diversifying the educator workforce because whether students see teachers that look like them matters, ensuring equitable access to and supports for success in rigorous and culturally sustaining coursework, providing access to integrated wraparound services and supports, and co-developing inclusive, discipline, and just co-policies. And I actually want to take just one moment to play a clip because I just think it's so powerful. And it really shows that it's not necessarily just Grace's experience, but this is really happening across the country.
Like, I was always satisfied with where I was, but I never really had like this sense of belonging that came from the school. And like, I don't know, I guess I think being a black girl had a little bit to do with that, especially because I took 2 AP classes my senior year, and in both of those classes I was the only black person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that that's happened like throughout my entire high school career. Like, if you like, there was one black student union meeting where they said like, how many of you guys have like a bunch of classes where you're the only black student in the class, and pretty much everyone in the room raised their hand.
So even things like access to advanced courses sends messages to kids about whether they belong. And so it's really important that schools are thinking about social, emotional, and academic development in terms of how they're creating the structures to really support the development of students. And so talking about these recommendations is more useful if we really know where states are at in terms of these policy areas. So thankfully, I was able to look to the work of my colleague, Eric Duncan, who last year scanned the country for state policies and teacher diversity. And I applied that to the remaining policy areas I just discussed. And from the teacher diversity scan, EdTrust developed a digital tool where advocates can look at their states and states across the country to see what policies have been adopted, and policymakers can see bright spots to emulate. And we aim to do this for the rest of these policy areas as well, and their connection to social, emotional, and academic development. And so we partnered with CASEL, which is the leading organization in social emotional learning, to conduct scans to understand how states can improve their efforts to support social, emotional, and academic development. At EdTrust, we're focusing on scanning the policy areas I just discussed, and CASEL has taken on another scan for which states are truly connecting their explicit social and emotional learning efforts to equity. And together, we hope to provide a tool that really connects social, emotional, and academic development and shows how states can improve their efforts to support this work. And so, why states? Why are we scanning at the state level instead of what the federal government is doing or the district level? And the answer is because states have a lot of power. They have so many levers that they can use. And so in our state scans, we really look at three main levers that states have to change what's happening in districts. One is they can really collect good data and they can publicly report it so that advocates like you and district leaders and others can really see what's happening, and then make changes based off of what they see happening. Secondly, states can set policies, guidance, and provide funding to really change and impact what local education agencies are doing. And third, they can set state goals, which really sends the message to districts that this is something that really needs to happen and change. And so in each of these policy areas that I mentioned, we scan for what states are doing in each of these policy levers. And so I want to give just a couple of examples. One is from the discipline scan. One of the questions that we ask is whether states prohibit discriminatory hair and grooming codes. And this really matters because we've seen across the country that Black students in particular have walked into schools with hair twists or with braids, and they've been told that their hair is unacceptable. That sends messages that their background is not welcome within the school. And you could see that from Grace's example. She got very frustrated, of course, when she was told that she had to change her hairstyle or be sent home the next day. And so states can have a really big impact on this, such as California, which has passed the Crown Act, prohibiting discrimination against students based on hairstyles. Alternatively, we have states like Kentucky that has no protections against discrimination based on hairstyle. Another example is whether states require districts to equitably enroll students in advanced coursework opportunities. Both from Grace's example as well as the audio clip I played, you can see how important it is to give opportunities to students equitably in order to access these courses. Illinois has passed a bill that will start requiring automatic enrollment beginning in 2023. Georgia, on the other hand, has no requirement to equitably enroll students in advanced coursework and has instituted a cap on dual enrollment credit courses. So they're doing the opposite of what we want them to see them do. They're actually making it harder to access advanced courses. Michigan is a little in between. They require districts to provide information to students in 8th grade or higher about opportunities to take college courses, but they don't actually require the automatic enrollment process, which is really what we'd like to see, because even if you have the information, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can get access. And a third example is whether states provide guidance and funding to districts to provide professional development to equitably support SEAD. And particularly for this one, we're looking for things like whether states encourage or provide resources for professional development in anti-racism, addressing their own mindsets and things like that. Things that are really connected to whether or not educators can provide equitable social emotional support. And you can see from Grace's experience that she had several educators throughout the day that frankly were pretty discriminatory and hadn't addressed their own biases. And that's something that states can really push districts to ensure their educators have. Minnesota, for example, requires that all educators renewing their license complete cultural competency training that the state provides, and the state provides additional funding for programming so that educators can support their ability to teach diverse learners. And this includes an anti-racism program. Alternatively, you have a state like North Carolina that doesn't provide any guidance or funding to provide professional development in equitably supporting SEAD. And so we're going to transition to breakout rooms now. And so I'd like you to consider from Grace's experience when she went searching for a school counselor and wasn't able to access one because they were too busy. We scanned for whether states mandate each school has a specified and adequate school counselor to student ratio. And specifically, we're looking at the ASCA's recommended ratio of 250 students per one school counselor. And no states mandate that. Currently, no states do. We do have a couple of states like Louisiana that doesn't mandate school counselors for K through 8, but mandates a ratio of 450 students to one counselor for grades 9 through 12. And they provide a little bit of state funding. That is insufficient, but it is better than, for example, Massachusetts, that doesn't mandate school counselors for any grades at all. And so I'd like for us to break into two groups to talk about why this policy would matter for a student like Grace and why this policy would matter for social, emotional, and academic development. And when we release this tool, how can we use the scan to advocate for a policy change in this area? Let me see if I can handle the breakouts. Okay, sending you all into breakouts now. Welcome back, everyone. Would anyone like to share out anything from the groups? Sorry, go ahead, Allison.
This is Allison. We had a great conversation in our breakout session, and one of the things that came up when we were discussing that first question about why this policy matters, we just talked about not just how hard it is when students can't seek out a counselor and the impact that that has, but when counselors aren't able to proactively find kids and quote unquote catch their needs early. And then we talked about, if the state doesn't make that a priority and fund it, it's very hard for districts to be able to make it a priority or to be held accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I heard two things, one from each group, on how to use the SEAD scan to advocate for policy change. And so I will just report out those two things because I thought they were really interesting. Someone in Allison's group talked about how the scan could be used to find states that are similar to theirs in terms of demographics and voting blocks, and find policies that they're doing that could be emulated, because it's harder to look at a state that is totally different in terms of voting and in terms of what's happening in politics there, and say we should adopt that. But if you can find a state that's similar to yours doing something pretty good, you could at least bring that to the legislation. And then from Kayla's group, there was someone who put in the chat that you could use the scan to get students involved, and you could show them the data of what's happening within their states in their interest areas. And that could lead to more student advocacy, and that's super important. So I just wanted to share those two things because I thought they were really great ideas. So I want to know if anybody has any questions about the SEAD scan, about how we think about social emotional academic development, or really anything to do with what was discussed today. I'm happy to answer anything that comes up. Oh, and I see Benjamin's comment that Allison gave some awesome thoughts about different avenues to bring SEL into schools and communities. Yes, Allison, I can do that. So the American Rescue Plan is like pretty much an unprecedented amount of money that's being infused into districts and schools right now. And that is a huge opportunity for states to think about how they can target those dollars to really create or address some of the structural issues that have existed in education for such a long time. So that includes making sure that students have access to school counselors. That includes making sure that students have access to dual enrollment or advanced courses or rigorous and culturally sustaining curriculum at all levels of education. So these are really, the ARP dollars are like a really great opportunity to really think about how we address a lot of the systemic issues that have existed for too long in education. Allison, you're welcome to come off mute and add more if you'd like to. Okay. But again, does anybody have any questions at all?
I'm going to come off mute for a second while people are thinking of their questions, just to flag that while this big 50-state scan won't be publicly launched until the winter, the the content, the digging that we've done is nearly done. We're working on making sure it's accurate in partnership with state education agencies. But if you find yourself in a situation where you want to know about a state level policy in your state related to social, emotional, academic development, whether that be how teachers are being trained, what kind of wraparound services are being provided, how the state is encouraging or requiring community or family engagement, please reach out, because while it's not public yet, we are happy to help you, particularly as you're gearing up for legislative sessions.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, please do feel free to reach out and ask any questions about what policies pertain to your state specifically. I see a question in the chat. What are some leading SEAD practices that districts could invest ARP funds into? I'm a big proponent of one, professional development in a variety of things, in particular around restorative justice practices and anti-bias training. Those are going to be really important this year. We've already seen, like across the country, there have been reports of increases in discipline, and that is, it would be remiss not to recognize that that's going to happen because students have been out of school for 18 months, have had a lot of stress, and are not used to coming back into school in this particular way. Not to mention, there's still like a lot of stress around COVID-19 as well as other issues related to it. And so I think that making sure that educators are really prepared to support students throughout like the next year or two and beyond, of course, but especially the next year or two and their needs is going to be absolutely critical. Any other questions? Oh, we're actually at time. But if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer anything. And so, again, just a couple of links in case you want to see some of the work that we've done. The SEAD report, we have a discipline guide that focuses on supporting Black girls in particular, and the teacher diversity scan that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which the SEAD scans will look similar to. Okay, thank you all very much. And I hope you have a great boot camp.